The bridge that refused to fall, the forgotten engineers of WW2. At 4:47 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the frozen fog over the Salm River valley carried sounds that didn't belong. Metal scraping stone, timber splintering, and beneath it all the rhythmic clang of sledgehammers striking iron in water, so cold it burned. Sergeant Emil Kovac, a 32-year-old railway carpenter from a Slovenian village whose name appeared on no military maps, stood waist-deep in that current, his hands purple around a crossbeam that weighed more than 3 men. The bridge above him, what remained of it, hung like broken vertebrae against the winter sky. German artillery had found it 6 hours earlier, collapsing 2 spans and leaving the central pier listing at an angle engineers later calculated as structurally impossible. Yet Kovac had ordered his squad into the water anyway, because 15 kilometers east, the 82nd Airborne was encircled, and this river was the only line between them and annihilation. His men were not engineers. They were farm boys who'd learned to splice rail ties, factory workers who understood leverage, a fisherman who knew how currents moved beneath ice. None had degrees. None had built anything larger than a barn. But Kovac had noticed something the retreating Wehrmacht engineers missed in their haste. The original bridge's foundation stones were Roman, laid 17 centuries earlier by legionaries who understood permanence. Those stones hadn't moved. The modern superstructure had failed, but the ancient heart remained. He traced the submerged blocks with frozen fingers, mapping a geometry older than nations, and realized the bridge could be rebuilt, not by replacing what fell, but by remembering what endured. The division engineer, a West Point graduate named Captain Hollis, had laughed when Kovac proposed it. "You want to sink timber pilings into a December river, under artillery fire, using hand tools and prayer. Sergeant, this isn't the Middle Ages." Hollis had calculations, projections, requisition forms for a Bailey bridge that would arrive in 4 days. 4 days the surrounded paratroopers didn't have. 4 days, that meant the difference between evacuation and mass graves. Kovac had simply asked, "Sir, how long do Roman bridges last?" and returned to the water before Hollis could answer. It was insubordination. It was also the only plan that began immediately. By dawn, they'd sunk 8 pilings into the riverbed, lashed to the Roman stones with cables stripped from wrecked trucks. The timber came from a bombed church 200 meters upstream, oak beams that had held vaulted ceilings for 300 years, now repurposed into compression members. They worked in shifts of 12 minutes, the maximum time a man could stay submerged before hypothermia took motor control. Private Weiss, the fisherman, dove repeatedly to guide crossbeams into position, his lips blue, his movements slowing with each descent until Kovac physically pulled him from the water and ordered him to the fire. Another man took his place. Then another. The artillery never stopped. Shells walked across the valley in patterns, searching. Twice, explosions lifted water high enough to drench the entire work crew. Once, shrapnel killed a man named Dietrich before he could scream. They pulled his body onto the bank, covered his face with his own coat, and kept building because stopping meant his death purchased nothing. The work acquired a rhythm that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with survival. One man would descend into the water while 2 others prepared the next beam on shore. A fourth watched the tree line for muzzle flashes that preceded incoming rounds by 3 seconds. Enough time to shout a warning, not enough to find cover. They learned to read the artillery's pattern, to recognize the difference between ranging shots and fire for effect, to steal minutes of frantic work between bombardments. Kovac moved among them constantly, his voice never rising above conversation, adjusting a joint here, repositioning a cable there, embodying a calm that was pure performance. His hands shook when no one was watching. At one point, Corporal Brenner asked him if he actually knew what he was doing. Kovac replied, "I know wood, I know stone, "I know water doesn't lie." It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. The breakthrough came not from engineering, but from observation. Corporal Hahn, who'd worked in his father's sawmill since age 9, noticed the pilings shuddering under each impact, not from the structure's weakness, but from resonance. The bridge was absorbing shock like a drumhead, transmitting every vibration into catastrophic harmonics that would eventually tear the joints apart. He suggested offsetting the timbers at irregular intervals, breaking the pattern, disrupting the wave propagation. Kovac didn't understand the physics. He didn't need to. He trusted the man who'd spent 20 years listening to wood under stress, who could diagnose a failing beam by the pitch of its groan. They adjusted 16 joints, staggering them asymmetrically according to no formula Hahn could articulate, only feel. And the shuddering stopped. The bridge, incomplete and impossible, stood. At 11:20 a.m., a Sherman tank tested the span. Engineers had calculated it couldn't support 15 tons. The Sherman weighed 33. Kovac stood on the Roman stones, watching the deck flex, listening to timber groan in frequencies his body understood before his mind did. The tank's commander, a lieutenant named Parcell, had volunteered for the crossing after Hollis refused to order anyone onto what he called a coffin on pilings. Parcell's face was visible through the open hatch, pale and set, as the Sherman's treads bit into the improvised decking. The bridge flexed, timber screamed, but it held. Then another tank crossed, then supply trucks, ambulances, jeeps loaded with wounded, and finally at 2:34 p.m., the lead elements of the 82nd Airborne, faces blackened with soot and frostbite, moving in silence too profound for gratitude. By nightfall, 1,147 soldiers had crossed the bridge that shouldn't exist. German intelligence reported it destroyed. Allied command had written off the position. Yet the crossing continued for 16 hours, uninterrupted, because a carpenter had remembered that before engineering became a science, it was a conversation between men and materials. Official records credit the 82nd's escape to tactical flexibility and favorable terrain. No commendations were issued to Kovac's squad. The bridge itself lasted 4 more days before a direct hit finally collapsed the Roman stones, ending a structure's defiance that had spanned 2 millennia and 1 desperate winter night. Kovac returned to railway work after the war, rebuilt village crossings in Slovenia, and never mentioned the Salm River. When interviewed decades later by a graduate student researching battlefield engineering, he said only, "We didn't build something new. We just listened to what was already there." By then, military academies taught the incident as a case study in adaptive engineering under fire, though none could replicate the irregular joint pattern that made resonance impossible. The bridge refused to fall because its builders refused to forget. That strength isn't always calculated, that sometimes the oldest answers outlast the newest questions, and that the most dangerous assumption in any crisis is believing expertise can be found in freezing water holding timber waiting for someone to listen.